Dear colleagues and friends, good evening. We are about to begin our traditional press briefing dedicated to another decision on the key rate. This press conference is being attended by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. And to begin with, we will hear the statement of the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Good evening. Today, we have made the decision to cut the key rate to 16% per annum. Inflation has been slowing down. In November, this deceleration was even slightly faster than we expected, which was associated not only with persistent, but also, to a great extent, one-off factors. That said, in the coming months, prices will be considerably affected by the VAT rise and the increase in administered prices. The resulting impact is yet to be estimated. We take all of the above into account when determining the pace and scale of the key rate reduction. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Firstly, inflation. Current price growth rates have been volatile in recent months. They were up in October but dropped in November. Goods with highly volatile prices, namely fruit and vegetables, as well as petrol, have largely contributed to these dynamics. Petrol prices have stabilized following their rapid growth and have even edged down owing to the measures taken by the government. According to weekly data, annual inflation has already decreased below 6%. The full-year price growth in 2025 will be at the lowest level over the past 5 years. Current growth rates of underlying inflation measures were also down to around 4% in annualized terms in November. However, it would be premature to draw conclusions about whether this deceleration is transitory or long-term based on 1 month's data. On average, over October-November, current growth rates of most underlying inflation measures remained slightly above 4%. In addition, inflation will temporarily accelerate in early 2026 due to the VAT increase. In December, certain companies have already started to adjust their prices considering this factor, although its main effect is yet to materialize. By contrast, some companies are seeking to sell out their stocks faster at the end of the year ahead of the VAT rise, offering customers attractive prices which might have a temporary disinflationary effect. In January, prices will also be impacted by additional indexation of housing and utility tariffs and other administered services and prices. Given the updated indexation parameters, the influence of one-off factors on inflation might be more significant next year than we estimated in October. The VAT increase affects a wide range of goods and services and therefore may influence inflation expectations. In November, December, they were up both among households and more notably among businesses. The rise in inflation expectations is a tangible factor as they influence not only decisions on purchases, but also the attractiveness of interest rates. After all, when deciding to deposit money, take out a loan, or invest in a new project, people and companies explicitly or implicitly weigh the expected return against the expected price growth. This means that we have to consider this factor when making decisions on the key rate in order to maintain monetary policy as tight as necessary to bring inflation to the target. Secondly, the economy. The economy continues to return to a balanced growth path, which is evidenced by the decline in inflation. According to our estimates, it will cool from its overheated state in H1 26. High-frequency data show that economic growth slightly sped up in Q4 25 as compared to the previous quarter, including in mining and quarrying and in manufacturing. Consumer activity growth remains strong, having accelerated following its smooth slowdown in H1 25. This trend is particularly pronounced in public catering and a number of other services, as well as in the non-food segment. In recent months, consumption growth has been additionally fueled by the expansion in demand for cars in anticipation of the rise in the recycling fee. The October-December business surveys show that companies are more optimistic about future demand for their products as compared to the previous quarter. This is associated with the easing of monetary conditions that happened earlier. However, the dynamics remain highly uneven across industries. Investment activity growth has been mostly decelerating while also demonstrating mixed trends across sectors. Over the past year, there has been a slight decline, for example, in construction, where investment levels were record high in the previous years, as well as in transport and certain mining and quarrying sectors. Nevertheless, the investment volume in the economy as a whole remains close to the 3-year highs. In January-September 2025, fixed capital investments totaled over 26 trillion rubles. In real terms, this amount is at a par with the one recorded over the same period last year. As for the labor market, its tightness has been decreasing, albeit slowly. Surveys show that the percentage of enterprises experiencing labor shortages has been gradually declining. It is already notably below its peak levels observed last year. Companies are planning to raise wages more moderately in 2026. Certain industries have been registering growth in part-time employment, although it remains low in the economy as a whole. Thirdly, monetary conditions. They remain tight, but have slightly eased overall compared to October. Amid decreasing loan rates, corporate lending continued growing rather quickly in October and November. Moreover, this growth is observed across a wide range of industries and companies. Mortgage and car lending also continue to expand, albeit less notably than corporate lending. The acceleration in credit growth is a natural response to monetary policy easing. It is important that the Bank of Russia maintains monetary conditions as tight as necessary to ensure balanced growth of lending compatible with sustainably low inflation. As we have already noted, deposit rates have stopped declining. They have even edged up for some maturities as compared with early October, maintaining the attractiveness of ruble deposits. Concurrently, households are becoming increasingly more interested in other forms of savings, including investments in the securities. Saving activity stays at a historically high level overall. Briefly, about external conditions. Prices for key Russian exports are running lower than forecast by the Bank of Russia. This is attributable to both deteriorating conditions in the global markets of certain commodities and the impact of sanctions. Despite worsening external conditions, the ruble remains strong. The first factor is the effect of the fiscal rule. The second one is the influence of a tight monetary policy, which supports modest imports growth, thus reducing demand for foreign currency. Owing to high interest rates, ruble assets remain more attractive than foreign ones. Furthermore, demand for foreign currency is contracting due to the measures ensuring import substitution and supporting domestic producers. These are structural factors whose impact materializes over a longer-term horizon. In the short run, the ruble exchange rate is affected by expectations regarding geopolitical developments. The ruble appreciation that happened this year continues to produce a disinflationary effect, although it has already become weaker. I will now speak of risks. Pro-inflationary risks prevail over the next year's horizons. Risks stemming from tight labor market, characterized by labor shortages, remain high. Another significant risk is the increase in inflation expectations caused by the VAT rise in tariff indexation. Furthermore, there are risks related to external conditions, in particular oil prices. Finally, credit dynamics may also carry risks. If the expansion in lending and accordingly in money supply is excessive, this might hinder the economy's return to a balanced growth path and exert pressure on prices. Geopolitics is also a considerable source of uncertainty. That said, we take into account disinflationary risks as well, particularly the risk of a substantial slowdown in domestic demand growth. And finally, regarding our future decisions, the scale and pace of further monetary policy easing will depend on the sustainability of the inflation slowdown and the dynamics of inflation expectations. Should pro-inflationary risks emerge, we might need to make pauses between the key rate changes. This means that the key rate will not be lowered on autopilot. We will regularly monitor all key indicators of the Russian economy and external environment and adjust the key rate path accordingly, if necessary. In the coming months, we will pay close attention to how prices, as well as households and businesses' expectations, respond to the VAT increase and tariff indexation, and how the situation unfolds in terms of other pro-inflationary and disinflationary risks, that is, whether they become stronger or weaker. Sustainably low inflation that we are striving to achieve is the only way to ensure moderate interest rates for all and a predictable environment for making long-term investments and plans. This paves the way for stable economic development and people's welfare growth. And that is what we expect to see next year. So, wishing you a Happy New Year. Thank you for your attention. Now, colleagues, over to your question. Please introduce yourselves and identify your agency. Marsha, in the first row, please. Good afternoon. TASS Information Agency. Maria Stepanova, could you tell us what were the options on the table that you were considering during the Board of Directors meeting? That is a traditional question. We reviewed 3 options. The one to keep the rate unchanged, then lowering it down by 0.5% and just by 1 percentage point. So those who proposed to keep the key rate as it was paid greater attention to the fact that in the meantime it is premature to consider whether the inflation is slowing down, because it has been volatile over the past few months. I already mentioned October and November. And just judging by 1 month, it would be quite difficult to decide on how stable it might remain, considering the pro-inflationary factors that are to emerge soon, like indexation and tariffs. Also, attention was paid to a significant speeding of credit activity and the increased inflation expectations remaining. So those who suggested that we do more, they expressed an opinion that the kind of the inflation slowdown that has been going on is already quite sustainable. But under such circumstances, the majority believed that one should decide on a more balanced and cautious approach to reduce the key rate by 0.5%. Colleagues, please. Sergei in the second row. Sergei Bolotov, the Russian Gazette. The inflation data covering November and the start of December, particularly the seasonal adjustments, look in such a way that one already would be congratulating the central bank over its long-expected victory over inflation. Is it premature? Have we gone through most of the journey or not yet? And if we are nearing the middle of it, already past it, how quickly the distance is going to shorten between the nominal rate and the neutral rate? Thank you. Well, I can definitely state that we've gone through a significant part of this journey, but the second run has, we know, is much harder. Any marathon runner knows about it. You may recall how we compared the way we were moving with regard to the rate, not only the rate, but also with regard to the whole economy, with a short-term journey. Low inflation within 1 month is not enough, definitely. And that is why we are paying stronger attention, and you definitely saw it through our publications and communication, not only 1 month's inflation, but the 3 months long inflation, the fluctuating one, adjusted from the seasonality of the past months, this was 2.5%, which is above our target. Add on to this inflation expectations, and you will understand why we're being so prudent and cautious about reducing the key rate. The inflation expectations remain quite high, so we account for all of it. And, a forecast about the key rate, we see that the neutral rate is the one that we're going to move towards in 2027. Dear colleagues, please. Yana. Yana Zhukova RIA Novosti. Today, after the central bank's decision again to reduce the rate, many major banks have already decided to bring down their rates with regard to the market-based mortgage instruments. And I wanted to ask you a question because of it. Against which key rate do you think the mortgage market is going to rebound, and will it happen already next year? Well, first of all, we already note that the market mortgage activity is growing. Of course, the prevailing part in mortgage contracts is the subsidized one, the family one, but at the same time we see that the market mortgage activity responded to the reduction of the key rate, and further on, as the inflation goes down, as the key rate is brought down, the mortgage activity will definitely grow. Now, what will be the level of rates? I suppose it would be quite pronounced once the key rate is near the neutral range. Thank you. The next question comes from Krasnodar, from Artyom Permyakov, RBK South and Northern Caucasus, from Krasnodar. Yes, hello. As of January 1st, 2026, VAT is going to be raised up to 22%. So in what way the central bank was taking into account this increase, making its decision about the key rate today, and what will the way that the central bank may compensate for the possible price increase? Thank you. We accounted for the fact that the VAT increase may considerably impact prices over the next few months. And one should say that it has already been reflected upon the inflation expectations, but it is yet for us to understand what the outcome of it will be in terms of the fact by deciding on the speed of the key rate reduction. Because we believe that our tight monetary policy enables one to reduce this transitory effect of high volatility into the prices, including the secondary effects, and it all deters inflation. With your permission, I would like to further elaborate. The VAT effects have been taken into account in our forecast and in our decisions back during the October board meeting, because the October board meeting decision was already based with the view over the VAT rise. And the second consideration, I would like to underscore that within the midterm perspective, looking at the next full year, the VAT rise would be disinflationary compared to whether it shouldn't have been done with the fiscal system encountering much higher deficit. Good evening, Yuri Lilov from Bitcoin Agency. These days, some of the brokers, they propose decentralized exchange of the blocked assets in the format of paper against paper. Now, my question is, what do you think about the possibility of this future exchange? And in case it doesn't take place, or it takes place but not in full, then what kind of a decision the regulator might make for the market in order to unblock the assets belonging to the Russians? We haven't received any official documentation describing such possible swaps or exchanges, so it's premature to talk about anything taking place on our side. Anastasia Savilieva, Interfax Agency. You do not rule out the spike in price growth nor in January, but also on top of it, maybe in some other months or in the next years. Consequently, do I understand correctly that within the monetary policy realm you will continue acting very gradually? And my second question, has the central bank already calculated the effect from the VAT subsidization compared in the area of banking card transactions? Do you agree that the bank, like the banks are saying, that it will cost them 200 billion rubles? And would you also allow them not to move these additional extra costs upon their customers, or is it at their discretion? Well, indeed, we're quite cautious about making any decision about the rates, bearing in mind the strong pro-inflationary risks based on our baseline scenario. As you have seen, we intend to reduce the key rate, but considering the factors related to the high pro-inflationary expectations and others that we have so far enumerated, will definitely act in a very cautious way. Now, with regard to the inflation dynamics throughout the next year period, yes, quite possibly a certain growth. The current growth, price growth rate may speed up in January because of the VAT rise. But we think that the stable inflation after such a speed up will continue to go down, and that in the second half of the year, the stable inflation components will show the 4% level. There possibly could be a slight price growth increase in the end of the December once the indexation will start coming in, but it will also be temporary. Oh yes, the second question was about the banking acquiring services. We expect that very shortly the Minister of Finance is going to come out with this explanation about the list of transactions that will be subject to VAT, and only after that one can come up with better estimates. But overall, it is quite evident that avoiding tax exemptions might impact the payment market. Of course, there is a risk that the banks would move their additional costs into their tariffs, but this movement must take into account within the context of general tax changes. And if, like Mr. Zabotkin already noted, if the choice between higher taxes and higher fiscal deficit, you need to make up your mind. The second one is less pro-inflationary. The first one is less pro-inflationary than the second one. Now, the way inflation is going to be translated into not the inflation, but into the higher prices, like throughout the rest of the economy, the economic entities will be deciding on their own. But at the same time, taking into account the demand as well as the competitive environment which is out there, because in the payment market there is also a competition. So I believe that the banks will definitely consider this. Thank you very much, Anastasia Bashkartova, The Independent Gazette. Going back to the inflation target issue, my question is like a bit of a summary. Now, why do you think, despite an extended period of really tight monetary policy so far, it was not possible to achieve this target of 4% level? Now, what deters you? At which point, at which part of it, there is a failure? Well, we believe there is no failing in our attempts to do so, simply because over the past few years, pro-inflationary risks materialized. Inflation has been accelerating, and I remind you that in the end of 2024, a whole year ago, if you consider the monthly price growth rates and you annualize them, they were about 14%, which means that we entered the year with a very high inflation. And we didn't set ourselves a task this year to secure ourselves at the target, because that wouldn't have been any soft landing, and it would have produced the risks that next year would have deviated very much lower from the target. And that is why our estimate in the beginning of the year, if you may recall, for inflation towards this year, 7 to 8%. Inflation has been slowing down faster under the influence of the tight monetary policy that we're pursuing. So that is why we believe that our policy is working, and as we've planned, we are now doing the balanced credit activity and overall balanced economic growth. Thank you. The next question comes from Yekaterinburg, from Anton Glukov. URA-RU. Please, Anton. Good evening. Over the past few years, the central bank has successfully dealt with the 2022 shocks, bridled inflation, but the economy entered into the period of structural changes. So now, in the end of 2025, how are you managing to balance, on the one hand, between the need to hold inflation down, but on the other hand, to incentivize lending and to incentivize growth? Which of these two is your top priority? Our top priority is price stability. and it does not contradict the objectives to develop credit activity and the investments for the sake of economic growth. It serves all the necessary conditions both for stable and sustainable economic growth. But I would like to say that stable low inflation is not some kind of ministerial task. It's a foundation for a normal economic development, including the long-term lending, long-term investments into developing the manufacturing in this country. And that is why it is much more important to try and draw the line underneath this long period of high inflation. Actually, the credit activity growth hasn't stopped. If you look back over the past 3 years, since 2023, including the current year, credit activity grew very substantially. The recent data of the end of December tells us that the credit portfolio, generally, in the economic language, that is the economic requirements, it has reached 155 trillion rubles, and that corresponds to the credit portfolio having grown 55% since the end of 2022. A very considerable growth was also in real terms. If you net it from the inflation impact, 35% over the past 3 years, the credit activity has grown. But what's important is that it contains not only short-term lending. Above 45% in this growth are the credits for more than 3-year maturity, and such loans are usually being secured for investment purposes. So such a considerable credit activity growth in many ways also produced a significant investment growth, and like I mentioned in my introductory remarks with regard to investments, one should take a closer look at the statistics and the figures. Over the first 3 quarters, investment into the fixed capital amounted to 26 trillion rubles. That is additional 10% on top of the last year. Now, if you are adjusted by the price growth, it's positive 0.05%, which doesn't seem to be too much. But what I would like to highlight, the existing level of investments, the amount of investments being down, it has already reached a record level, and it will all support the production opportunities. My colleagues are describing a certain case which enables one to take a look at this investment growth rate as well as the achieved investment level, similar to an automobile. In order to drive faster, it's once enough really to put your foot on the pedal and just let it roll on without always increasing it. And so, following this analogy, it's not the investment growth that counts, but the level achieved, its productivity, to the extent to which it leads to the labor output, and that defines the growth of the domestic gross domestic product in many ways. Thank you. Elena, in the row before the last one. Elena Fabrichna, Reuters. My question is related to the claim that the Bank of Russia brought against Euroclear. Do you already understand what kind of assets could be the subject of that claim? Are going to be customer deposits in Euroclear? Do you think that the European Commission will change its mind and will run the risks of being brought to court? Well, we're not planning to recall our claims, but your question was about how the court ruling is going to be enacted and how any damage is going to be covered. It will be decided once there is any definite decision handed down. But we also consider to protect our interests in the international arbitration court with the subsequent enforcement of such sentences in other jurisdictions. Mikhail Massey, Frank Media. You have already mentioned that as of 2026, the banking card transaction VAT is going to be introduced. So what's your general attitude towards it? Do you currently see that there's a growing share of cash payment compared to the non-cash card payments, or do you anticipate any risks of cash starting to circulate more? Another question, the record high corporate lending levels in October, November. How do you explain it? Don't you believe that this is higher than what should be attributed to your efforts to achieve the inflation target? As far as the raising VAT on the banking transactions is concerned, I already look at it as something already given. The decision has already been made. That may bring about a certain increase in the tariffs applied, but once again, one should take this decision as part of a comprehensive tax change initiative, which were decided upon because of higher expenditures. The alternative was to increase deficit and the sovereign debt. If you compare these two options in line with our mandate, certainly raising the VAT is more disinflationary than the alternative to it. Now, with regard to payments moving into the cash area because of the VAT raise, I don't see any such risks at all, because people have already grown used to paying non-cash. It's very convenient, very fast, and they definitely prefer non-cash transactions. And in our statistics, we don't see yet, and I'm sure that we won't see that people will switch to using cash. Now, as far as the record growth in the corporate sector is concerned, indeed, there is a bit of a acceleration in credit activity. Partially it can be seasonal, because we have that, particularly since the number of those who receive the fiscal funding is growing, in an expectation that soon they're going to get the government money. But that could also be explained, not probably, but definitely, due to the easing of the monetary conditions. It's not a record high. It has sped up, indeed, since the beginning of the year, past H1, but the corporate lending growth is slower than what it used to be in 23-24. Now, with regard to the impact upon inflation, what we see as important is the overall growth rate in lending, and its growth turned out to be lower than what we expected in the beginning of the year. And we are looking not as much up as the credit growth, but the money aggregates. It is important how much resources are flowing through the government channel. It is always important, but such a corporate lending growth is something that you definitely need not to take your eyes off, and to what extent the money aggregates are going to grow, considering the fact that within the corporate lending we've got quite a big share on non-sensitive or less sensitive borrowers, sensitive to the interest rates. Thank you. Marina, please. Marina Pimenova, NTV Business News. Last year, following the final board meeting, you said that you would ask Father Frost for the balanced economic growth rate and the slowdown in price growth. Now, considering the fact that this year the central bank not a single time raised the key rate, it doesn't mean your wish came true, or is it about to come true? Or maybe you have some new wish to ask Father Frost for, since the last one really played out? Well, it's either my wish came true or our policy really was effective, but indeed we have come to see that the inflation has considerably slowed down. The economy is shifting towards the balanced growth path, and for next year's, I would very much ask us not only to touch the 4% level, but to achieve the price stability in a sustainable way. And I would very much like our people in this country and our businesses to feel the advantages of the low inflation. Thank you. The next question from Victoria Shergina, Law and Finance. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Inflation currently indeed is slowing down faster than expected, but the risks for the financial system on the country seem to be growing, first of all, because of a high debt burden upon businesses. Now, to what extent to the central bank it is currently very important to maintain financial stability? Does it affect your key rate decisions? And also, people are interested to find out to what extent the Russia's banking system is stable, and is it safe to keep one's money in the banks? So what could you tell people? Thank you. Well, the questions of financial stability are always of priority to us. They're always bear significance, but we currently don't see any risks to the financial stability, although you know that on a quarterly basis we come out with special reports covering financial stability risk. We judge vulnerabilities where they can appear. It is very important for us to prevent such risks materializing. We're looking at the advanced indicators and so on and so forth. So I can just answer your question in such a way that we don't see such risk right now, and it didn't affect our decision about the key rate. Now, with regard to the banking system stability, yes, it remains quite stable. We, yes, do see that there is a certain growth in problematic credits, but in terms of the corporate lending in such a category, it's not much, just about 4%, which is really not much. The banking system is well capitalized, once again, and we don't see there being any issues about it. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. One of these days it became known that the European Union didn't approve the confiscation of the blocked Russian assets. Now, do you link this outcome to your having expressed your position that you intend to, call upon the international courts? And do you believe that that was effective? And with regard to the Euroclear, little question, have you requested a closed hearing of that particular case? And if it is not going to be an open one, how are we going to find out about what has happened there? How are you going to communicate with the marketplace about it? Thank you. Well, it is difficult for me to comment upon which particular arguments on our side were strong enough. I'm sure that you read in the media different kinds of argumentation, but I first of all believe that it would have undermined the basic functioning of the international financial system, which is quite obvious. And now, with regard to the way our claims are going to be considered, yes, indeed, we requested a closed hearing because information is going to be provided which constitutes a banking secrecy, quite naturally. Now, what regards the course of hearing of our claim, we usually do not comment on the way the hearing is taking place. Thank you, dear colleagues. Ms. Natasha. Further on about Euroclear and your claims against this particular clearinghouse, our readership is interested. Why one should have to wait for 3 years before submitting a claim, considering the fact that the head of the Euroclear stated that this organization has assets in Russia worth a big amount of money, more than 18 billion. So why one had to wait for so long? I mean, the reason that we've initiated our claim right now, not before, well, there were certain circumstances that dictated this kind of a decision now, which I can comment upon not today. Now, in terms of the litigatory conditions and whatever, once the court sentence comes into effect, then it would be possible to express what we think about it. Good afternoon. Artyom Govorun, Invest Future. We currently find ourselves in a situation that we are seeing the inflation slow down. The key rate reduction cycle began, but the inflation expectations remain high. So with this in mind, I would like to find out what's more important for the Bank of Russia when making a decision about the key rate. Is it the dynamics of inflation, pro-inflation, or the inflation expectations? And a little bit more about assets. In what way the European Union decision to freeze perpetually the Russian assets may affect the frozen assets owned by the Russians? Well, with regard to the second part of it, it doesn't help in any way. Now, in terms of this diverse inflations and pro-inflation expectations, when these two move in different directions, that definitely exacerbates our ability to make a conclusion. It's much more difficult to, consider how stable these are, because around the situation there was quite a lengthy debate between the board of directors members, between those who were for keeping the rate as it was, and as well as those who suggested that we should make a more resolute step forward. So currently we believe that this kind of higher inflation expectations and the higher inflation expectations among the businesses, that is the response to the future VAT rise and indexation and other pro-inflationary factors, which we believe to be a very considerably remaining pro-inflation risks, because we're worried not only about the high inflation expectations, but the fact that they may get pegged to this high level. Besides this and other considerations, we are being quite reserved in terms of how active we are to reduce the key rate. Now, in between the monetary policy and its receptiveness to the inflation expectations, when they are unanchored, when they are high, unpredictable, so the inflation, when the inflation expectations are unanchored, inflation, its acceleration may happen with a high level of probability and as a response to a premature easing of the monetary policy as opposed to having them anchored. Yes, these diverse trends is what we need to analyze when making our decision, and that brings about this cautiousness in the way we act. All right. Thank you. Next question comes from Anastasia Murzinskaya from the city of Ijevsk, Udmurtia Information Agency, please. Good evening. Why, against the 16% key rate, the banks are offering loans at 4% and more? What is the reason behind this? Yes, this is the kind of question that continuously comes up, that the banks are offering the interest rates higher than our key rate. But what can I tell you? Because these kinds of interest rates are being proposed, but like you mentioned it, just to some customers. If you consider the average interest rates in October in terms of the business loans, they were within the range of 15 to 18%, depending upon the maturity. Construction developers, they stand apart from it because they're covered by escrow accounts and they get the interest rates at 10%. Now, anywhere above 24%, I think it was less than 4% of corporate loans taken. Of course, household loans are more expensive at about 23% within 12 months, if more than 17% on average. But high interest rates, where do they come from? It's because of the risk assessment by the banks when issuing. Let's take a look at the corporate lending case. If a loan is being asked by a business which has stable marketing, no overloading with credits, low debt burden, this business can get a much lower rate compared to a different business which can hardly make ends meet. So differentiation in terms of the corporate lending is quite broad. You can see it in the bonds market. If you take a look at the bond yields with high ratings, it's at about 15% right now. Now, with the least possible rating, there's already about 30%. I mean, a big difference in terms of the yield. Such differences can also be found in the credit rates. And actually, in as far as households and individuals are concerned, let's say in the mortgage market, comparing it to the credit cards, I mean, the rates are way different. Thank you. Dear colleagues, please, Anna, in the last row. Good evening, Anna Gronna from Anna Finance blog. My question is about non-core government pension funds because their remuneration comes from the fee for management and the fee for success. So it runs up to 20-25%. Now, because the non-government pension funds do invest in conservative assets, don't you believe that the success fee is kind of exaggerated because the pension income of the ordinary individuals is not very high without it? Thank you very much and Happy New Year. Thank you. One non-government pension funds in this country, I mean, their remuneration. Now, how it is important to approach the remuneration of the non-government pension funds. It is important to have them balanced and create a proper incentive. And what does it mean to have a proper incentive? So that the non-government pension funds should invest money specifically into the kind of assets which generate the biggest benefit from the point of view of income and risk mitigation for the future retirees and pensioners. That is why we decided to distance ourselves from the kind of models when remuneration actually did not depend upon the quality of management practices. You said you're quite right. As of last year, there are two parts: one for the management and then the success. And the reward for success is linked to the average 3-year deposit income. It's like a benchmark. If the fund makes more, then the remuneration also is bigger. Now, the part related to the management practices is going to be reduced by law as of 2027 once the non-government pension funds adapt themselves to the new system. And we're going to scrupulously watch over the way this new remuneration system is being used by the funds, and if necessary, we will introduce corrections. Thank you. Nikita. Good afternoon. Nikita Mitrofanov, Economical Telegram Channel. Recently, I've been baptized, really, in terms of my market practices. The bonds that I bought previously ended up being in default. So my question from it came, so in what way the default risk changed in the business sector compared to last year? Has it become stronger? And what are the expectations that the central bank has, not for the banking, but the business segment default for next year? And within the context of the business, I've got a little additional question. Have you ever thought with regards to the VAT in acquiring to at least protect the small businesses from this VAT, because they will encounter this VAT all of a sudden and they will put it into their expenses because they can't put together their sales or purchases ledger without being able to really set it off like the big businesses can do? Well, thank you very much. First about the DATs. We do not expect that the tight monetary policy may result in systemic growth in bad loans, because certain defaults do happen in any time period. We're very watchful over the quality of the corporate debt towards the banks, and generally the quality of the credit servicing. Despite higher interest rates, despite higher interest burden upon the businesses, remains high. I mean, we do the comparison within the historical periods, although in different sectors the overall picture is different, because within the single sector there could be different borrowers. And within, on the side of the banking credit portfolios, there is a growing share of businesses that the banks themselves put into the yellow category, the one that they are monitoring. But the most problematic part of it, the bad loans, which is within the 4th or the 5th category, since the beginning of the year, it has grown only by 0.05%. Of course, you're right. The situation is worse in the small businesses, where since the beginning of the year, the number of companies which are not capable to service their loans grew up to 9.8%. So here we recommended the banks in order to ease the burden for the debt servicing market players to do the restructuring, refinancing. We don't ask them to create the respective reserves if there is a possibility that such businesses may get out of the red. Now, the second question was about the acquiring VAT, but that is the question to the government. But in as far as the small and medium businesses are concerned and this burden, as October, we now have the law on the credit grace period coming into effect, under which the small and medium companies can use a delay, even if their revenue hasn't changed. You may recall that we used to have such programs for the households. So what do we see? That during the past 2.5 months, the banks have already received quite a number of applications, 17,000, and they offer the grace period within this particular law. But not only that, because what's so good about the law, it really forces the banks to come up with their own restructuring programs. And we do see that such refinancing and restructuring is taking place. You should also take into account that the key rate reduction, which in our baseline scenario is going to remain, very quickly translates into the lower interest rates. Why? Quickly, because a very meaningful share of loans to the small and medium businesses, they are based on the floating rate. Any more questions, dear colleagues? Yes, Ekaterina. Good afternoon, Ekaterina Litova from Vedomosti. Why do you believe the inflation rate in December, in the first few weeks, are so low, just 0.05%, although many warned that it will spike up on the eve of the VAT rise? That is my first question. And the second, how high do you believe the risks may be of a more significant domestic demand slowdown? Or would you need to incentivize it somehow additionally? I would ask Mr. Zabotkin to explain. Yeah, let's wait to see the full month figures, because 1 week, 2 weeks, not always precisely coincides with what we can see as the result of the full month. But one of the explanations that we heard from the governor previously today was that the government do not want very much to go through the end of the year with a lot of stocks remaining, because otherwise they will have it sell it. Well, they will have to sell it at a higher VAT next year. So trying to stock out could be an important factor that might impact prices in December. If that is the case, that the price dynamics will play it all back once we pass through the year-end threshold. So in order to make conclusions about inflation in December and November, one should wait not only the full December statistic, but also take a look at what might transpire in January, February. And from the point of view of demand dynamics, in the meantime, we see that the aggregate demand growth rate in the economics remains positive, were it otherwise, we would have witnessed very negative dynamics towards the year end, which is not happening. Thank you. Next question comes from the city of Vologda, from the Red North newspaper. Alexei, please. Good evening. In its time, the subsidized mortgage was cancelled in order to cool the market down and stabilize housing prices. Nevertheless, the real estate continues to grow in Vologda. One room apartment is at 4 to 5 million rubles. Why is that happening? Thank you very much for your question. The situation is very different in between different regions. We see that there are regions where prices this year have somewhat gone down, but in some regions they have considerably slowed down compared to the last period. We have an indicative situation in the region of Krasnodar, which traditionally has been considered to be most overheated from the point of view of the housing market. The prices there went up by 3.4%, below inflation. And actually, in the Vologda region, the price growth was similar to this. Now, throughout the whole country, the average in terms of the primary housing the prices for it have slowed down compared to 2024. Now, why the prices do continue to grow? First of all, the demand remains to be significant because we have cancelled the subsidized general mortgage program, but the family mortgage, the Far Eastern mortgage programs continue to be in place. People are more willingly going for the market-based mortgage because the general housing demand remains, quite a decent one. People actually buy apartments not only with a mortgage funding, because you can't look at the housing demand through the mortgage instruments. They can buy it in installments because, the overall installment, the delayed payment is worth several trillions of rubles, which is not reflected in the mortgage statistics. So the housing prices do grow because of a more active demand, because it has materially become more active. Looking at the H2 last year and the H1 this year. But what should do in order for the prices to slow down in their growth? Well, of course, the labor productivity should increase in the housing construction sector. There shouldn't be the kind of price growth that we saw over the previous years. Any more questions, Natalia, please? Good evening. Natalia Kotowska, Pro Finance blog. I would like to really make a little bit more specific question about what the previous question sounded about. The subsidized mortgage programs continue to really make people enjoy it because they boost the demand, but eventually other market players, they feel that it affects them through higher rates, through inflation pressure. So I've got two questions, if I may. First, can one say that the subsidized mortgage program, including the family mortgage, influences the prices, not through the expansion of demand, where the prices grow not only in the housing market, but because of the general price growth in the economy? And my second question, against what kind of a condition the subsidized mortgage program may exist without such major market distortions from the point of view of price growth, availability, and its impact upon inflation? Thank you very much for the question. You're absolutely correct. Any subsidization is being paid for by somebody else. That happens in any kind of a market. So any subsidization impacts demand and prices. So the whole issue is about how big it is, about its volume. If the scale of it is not big, then there won't be any big distortions in the market. That is why we've always said that subsidized program, it's no matter whether it's in housing or any other industry. It should be very much individualized, very much customized, and aimed at specific priorities without allowing for disbalances. And so large-scale, big, free-for-all mortgage program, really, they spiral the demand excessively, and purely on the physical side of it, it's impossible to grow the supply in the real estate. The housing prices do grow, and then as a chain reaction, that heats up the overall price level. Indeed, it does so, because competition grows. Competition for labor, particularly against the labor shortages, for inputs, for equipment, you name it. And so it all is reflected through the price pressure in the economy. So I will never cease to repeat. It is very important to have a subsidized program attached to a very specific case, because the family mortgage is a big one, but is very much individualized, and that remains the main driver behind the mortgage market development. This year, it accounted for about 70% of all of the mortgage loans. Now, the market-based mortgage is going to be more accessible and available as the inflation slows down, as the key rate slows down, and the interest rate slow down throughout the whole economy. Dear colleagues, Grigori, please. Good afternoon, Grigory Bajenov. Grigory Bajenov, Telegram channel. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on the new year. And secondly, my question, myself being a macroeconomist, I'm more interested in inflation expectations. Inflation expectations amongst the households and businesses currently, as you are saying to a large extent, are represented via inertia, or are they related to certain long-term factors which are not fully controllable by the monetary regulator? If that is the case, is there a risk that longer term the inflation expectations would be anchored at the level which would be higher than the target? I will ask Mr. Zapotkin to begin. Well, thank you very much for your question. My answer is going to be very quick. Of course, structural factors are not within the monetary authority's control. However, the monetary authority definitely can make the kind of decisions that shall compensate for such structural factors in a sufficient way for the actual inflation to eventually be a low one. If the household and the businesses would face low inflation, then their inflation expectations are going to be moderated in line with it. I would also like to add, sometimes you hear people saying, don't pay attention to the inflation expectations, the source of which you are not. But other factors do drive it. And just make your decision about the key rates without paying attention to the inflation expectation. If that should be the case, the inflation will really spiral, because the monetary authority, against high inflation expectation, must make the kind of decisions which will bring to low inflation. You take my word, if the inflation stays low for a considerable period of time without considering any kind of structural factors, the inflation expectations would definitely follow suit and go down. Good afternoon, Yulia Rastargova, Market Power Agency. Right now, some brokers are gathering applications from various investors to exchange the blocked assets, to change them for the Sberbank shares. So how do you assess the market consequences of this kind of an arrangement where the investments are not being compensated with monetary means, but the shares? Don't you believe that some of the investors may prefer to sell out of such securities rather than hold them long-term? And can it produce long-term impact upon the Sberbank ratings and its stock? Well, thank you very much. I won't be able to comment on the first part of the question because we haven't been receiving any information in terms of the potential overhang, supply overhang. It won't happen. I mean, if such deals ever take place, because there will be certain restrictions imposed upon the subsequent sales of it. Thank you very much. One additional comment that with regard to such information not coming to us, we do see that there are discussions taking place, but such transactions are would only be possible with the permission of the Government Commission. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's you're quite right. Thank you very much. Well, colleagues, please, is going to be the last question, I suppose. Good afternoon. Lyubov Neheda, Expert Magazine. On December 12th, at the Infrastructure Congress, the businesses make a proposition to introduce a separate rate for the public-private partnership in order for the number of public-private partnership in the industry to grow. Please tell us, what does the Central Bank of Russia thinks about this idea? Well, I've just given an answer about the subsidized mortgage program. That subsidization is something that always somebody is paying for. I mean, what you're talking about is going to be about additional subsidizations, but in other forms, and that would mean that for the rest of the marketplace, the rates are going to be higher. I mean, the subsidization programs are being applied by the government. They are quite broad, and if the government believes that the public-private partnership would be a higher priority than anything else and would reallocate resources in subsidization funding from other programs, then no problem about it. But that is in the government's remit. All right. Yes, let's have the last questions indeed. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question, because surprisingly, very few questions about the ruble exchange rate. Could you please share with us your understanding against which exchange rate the ruble exchange rate will cease to be disinflationary and will, regain its pro-inflationary effect. It's definitely impossible to quote the the specific figure, because you assess the dynamics. If the currently existing levels become weaker, then definitely it's going to be pro-inflationary. Mr. Zapotkin, let me add a bit more of a fog over this answer. I mean, the businesses are expecting to see specific exchange rate trajectory. Such expectations with regard to the future exchange rate are reflected in the current services and goods prices. If the exchange rate starts moving in a way that it will become weaker much faster than what the businesses are expecting, the ones that are selling big products, they will change their approach. I mean, so the answer is that this kind of an exchange rate depreciation is above what the market and the businesses are expecting right now, something that is already reflected in the current price level. Yeah, expectations, as you see, are also important, not only inflationary expectations. Well, dear colleagues, yeah, Rita, I mean, don't take offense, but, all right, so the very last question now. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. I also have a question about ruble. In the beginning of a statement, you noted that the tight monetary policy also creates an effect, as well as it comes from the structural factors. Now, with regard to the second part of your statement, in the beginning of December, Maxim Oryeshkin, the Minister for Economic Development, stated that the ruble exchange rate, amongst other things, can be affected by such not an obvious factor as crypto mining, and that Russia is a bit of an exporter of cryptocurrency, which is something that also impacts the exchange rate. Now, do you take this into account or you don't? If it really doesn't account for too much, so how much of it should be in order for you to start taking it into account? And now, whether the ruble appreciation also comes from a higher vehicle recycling fee. Thank you. Well, all of the factors that Mr. Oreshkin enumerated do exist, and it's really very good that he paid attention to such structural factors like what we've discussed last time, as to really restrain imports and strengthen import substitution and in government procurement, because the level of imports in our GDP has considerably gone down compared to what we remember from 2020, 2021, a very strong structural change. And that does impact the exchange rate, of course. Now, as far as crypto mining is concerned, I suppose that to make an assessment of its quantitative effect is difficult, because still most of the crypto mining remains in the gray zone. But it hasn't emerged only this year, because you can't link the ruble appreciation to the fact that crypto mining has all of a sudden came to be. But nevertheless, crypto mining indeed is one of the additional factors influencing a strong ruble exchange rate. Now, vehicle recycling fee. So in some part of the ruble appreciation, you can explain it by the fact that in October last year, and indexation in January this year of the vehicle recycling fee, because that brought about the reallocation of part of the imports in 2025 over 26, because the importers were trying to, bring more cars as fast as possible before the recycling fee was to grow. So the imports, nevertheless, have considerably been shorted this year. Now, official statistics, we don't have enough in order to understand for the vehicle imports to see whether it impacts the exchange rate. But if it does impact any price variations as a result of more open, transparent, rather than contraband, then the demand on the side of the consumers is not going to disappear, but that will definitely affect the ruble exchange rate, because the demand for import shall remain. So it shall depend upon what might happen in response to the imports coming into the open finance. Thanks very much for your questions. It's been a long day. Yes, Happy New Year for you. Health and happiness to you, to your family, to your listeners, to your readership, to all.